Hey guys, this is Phil Galfond, and this is the second part of a 5-10 session I played. I'll just jump right into the action. If you haven't watched the first part yet, I recommend doing so. I'll probably occasionally talk as if I was recording this in one session, because I pretty much am. So if you haven't seen the first, I wouldn't be surprised if I refer back to things that happened in that video without explaining them. So definitely go watch that if you haven't. Here on the top right with King 10 offsuit, if we were 100 deep, I alternate between calling and re-raising. I never fold. 200 deep, I prefer to call just because a decent player can make your life hell 200 deep out of position. And King 10 is not a hand that plays well deep stack. Here on the flop, when he bets really small, I think it means that I have the best hand almost always. And this isn't a raise I always make, but I felt that and again, I don't know a ton about him, and maybe that's just his standard c-bet size, but I felt that I had the best hand a ton of the time, and I also felt that he wouldn't really be making too many moves on me in general, because I'm a nosebleed player, and also just because it's just not a spot where people go crazy. On the turn, I'm definitely going to bet, and I was deciding on a bet size. I think that a large bet is kind of standard, like 175 or whatever, but I opted to go for a smaller bet, 115, and the reason I do this, or I guess the reasons I do this, one, I think that to a large bet he can fold a lot of his hands, like, I don't know, like ace-7, or things of similar strength, queen-8, things like that, just because he can see the pot getting pretty big and will be guessing on a lot of rivers. I also think that even though I was pretty confident on the flop that I had the best hand, and still am, I kind of want to confirm my read, and by betting small here and not getting raised, I can be almost positive that I have the best hand, so that I can very confidently value bet any blank river. And I also think that this will cause him to make a bad float if he had some kind of double float, if he had a float, maybe make a bad double float, a hand like Queen Jack, which actually plays okay versus my hand, but maybe even a hand just like King Jack or Jack 7. I guess Jack 7 might be calling a big bet anyways. Point is, I like to mix it up here, and I also think that a small bet like this will make him suspicious on blank rivers. I think a lot of people might interpret it as me trying to see a cheap card with a draw, although that wouldn't make a ton of sense, but that's kind of me not giving an unknown a ton of credit. On an ace offsuit river, it's a good river for me to value bet. It's really unlikely to have improved his hand. It's not really that much of a scare card. Ace is always kind of a scare card, but all the draws bricked off. But he folds pretty quickly, so he probably had some kind of draw or pair plus draw that just didn't feel like hero calling. And I'm still okay with the way I play that hand. I definitely, and when I bet on the turn small there, I mix it up pretty good, although when I'm playing 5-10, I probably will be a bit more exploitable than when I play against tougher opponents, and opponents that I play against more often. And here I'm just taking a note, just how the hand played out, because I think that I might be able to learn something from his, if that turns out not to be a standard bet size, I can learn a bit from his bet sizing, and if that's not his standard timing, where he called the flop and the turn pretty quickly, then I can learn a bit from that too. And it's likely that he had like a weak made hand or a draw, and I might be able to learn a bit about how he plays his weak made hands or draws, if it turns out he plays other hands differently. Here on the bottom left, I 3-bet 10 deuce suited. It's a Doyle Brunson hand, so it can't be bad. But it's one of those hands that I don't really love calling. I'm okay with calling that in position in the big blind. It's kind of close between call or fold for me. Probably recommend folding it for most people. It's just kind of a high variance spot, but I don't like to give up my big blind much in position. It's not a pride thing. It's just that I like playing pots in position, and it's not costing you that much pre-flop. But since it was close to call or fold, I decided just to 3-bet it and use it as a 3-bet bluff. Here on the top left, I am considering making a move. I ended up folding, but it's kind of a good spot for it. As far as I think that Zoli's going to be pretty light here, given his stats, he's pretty aggressive. He's squeezing. People usually will re-raise more when there's a raise and call in front of him than if there's just a raise. And also he's in position. People usually 3-bet more in position. And there's already what is that? Almost 250 in the pot. Am I doing that right? 70, 80, 85, 90. Yeah, it's 240 in the pot. And, so you don't have to pick it up all that often. I do, when I run into ace king or ace queen, have a good amount of equity. And, it's not to be ignored that you still have 20% equity when called by an overpair. The reason I decided not to is looking at the Patrick's stats. He's 18-13 and opened an early position. And McMath is fairly tight too, so there's a chance that he is slow playing something, though I'm not super worried about that. But given the fact that Zoli can have a big hand, or should have it some of the time and all that, and that Patrick could have a big hand, I decided to fold. It'd actually be interesting to run the math on this because I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out to be a shove, given somewhat reasonable assumptions. A hand like fives actually plays a little better than if Zoli's range is really polarized, it plays a bit better than hands like king queen or maybe even ace queen, depending on how polarized he is. Probably not better than ace queen, but king queen, because when you run into hands like, obviously ace king and ace queen are bad for king queen, but also when you run into hands like aces or kings. Like kings, fours do a lot better than king queen. But that's mostly irrelevant. It's kind of the fact that I have an okay hand when called against a range, and I also think that it's a spot where I can pick up a lot of dead money a good amount of time. Here on the top right, this is a pretty interesting hand. I decided to check raise, and the reason I did. Let me actually just go back a little bit. Well, there are a couple of reasons I did. One, this is a flop that he's going to be continuation betting a whole lot of the time. And secondly, he's involved in a big pot on the top left table. Not a big pot, but he just went all in. And I think that that'll make him... he's probably a multi-tabler, so it's not a huge effect, but I think it'll make him a little bit less likely to want to contest this one. And so I do have a backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. So I went ahead and check raised. It's pretty marginal, honestly. But I think people do polarize their ranges a bit on flops like this and check behind things like King 10, so that and like 5x, so he's not going to be... the majority of his betting range on the flop is going to be air. Now on the turn, I don't think that... I first of all have no equity when called, so it's really a pure bluff when I bet the turn, and I don't think I get enough folds to bet, so I do decide to go ahead and check. Had I turned a club, I would bet again, probably. And had I turned a gutter, I'd consider betting again, and likely 3-barrel. But that's iffy. So here he bets 200. Seems like a pretty standard give-up spot. But I was thinking I felt that he was really polarized in this spot. So let's look at hands that would bet call the flop. I would say that he has a hand like Ace X, occasionally like King Queen, King Jack, King 10, maybe even worse kings, depending on the type of player he is. Sets, obviously. And then I also think he would call with Queen Jack, Queen 10, and Jack 10, which actually makes up for a good amount of hand combos. Now, when I check the turn and he bets the turn, we can remove a few of those hand combos. I don't think he's betting any king on the turn. I'd be pretty surprised if he is. I also don't think he's betting hands like Ace 7 on the turn. He might be betting hands like Ace 10, but even a hand like Ace 10, I might expect him to check back some of the time. So I actually think a lot of his range here, when he bets a turn, his hands like obviously sets and two pair hands that didn't 3-bet the flop, which I think most wouldn't 3-bet the flop. But then all of his gutters, Queen Jack, Queen 10, Jack 10, and then, the occasional float if he somehow, I don't think he has I'm not too worried about the straight here, Deuce 4, so I don't think he plays that pre-flop, though he might play Deuce 4 suited. He could also have a hand like 3-4 or 2-3. Probably not 2-3 again, but 3-4 suited is very possible, and now he bets the turn just to avoid me sucking out with a hand like a hand I have. But I think that actually a good chunk of his range here is going to be hands like Queen Jack, gutters like that. And so I think this isn't a bad spot to put in a check raise bluff. It's also a spot where he has to give me a ton of credit. I don't see pretty much anybody check raise bluff flop and check raise bluff the turn. And I also think that if he did decide to bet a hand like here I'm looking at stats and I have no idea what I'm looking at, so I just quickly give up on that and go ahead with my read. What I was saying was, if he did bet a hand like Ace 10, I think that he might be able to give me a lot of credit here and lay a hand like Ace 10 down. I also don't think it's a spot where he's going to do anything with Queen Jack unless he picked up a hard draw. Just because he has to call 325. He can't shove because he gets it in, pretty much completely dead too often, and he also can't really call because he's gonna expect me to. He can't really expect me to check fold any real hand on the river, and if I do have air like I do, he might expect me to just shove the river and not give him an opportunity to bluff. So I don't expect him to play back at me with his floats. Even a hand like 4-3, I expect to just fold here. And even the hands as strong as Ace 10, which I think are possibly in his range, I think he might lay those down. Probably more than half the time, I'd expect him to lay those down. But the main reason for this is that I felt that his range is super polarized here, and I don't expect him, or I do expect him to have gutters a ton of the time. I was a little bit worried about his bet size. I was hoping that he would bet something like 150 or 170, and then I could check raise a little bit smaller, because I think those bets are a little weaker than a bet of 200 in general. But when I did check, I was thinking about check raising, especially if you bet small, and I just decided to go through with the plan. I think that it's kind of close to a neutral play, maybe slightly plus EV given all the assumptions, but it's something that's really important to have in your arsenal because you really have to be able to punish people for betting the turn when you check to them, because otherwise betting the turn when checked to is just too powerful a play, and you kind of get owned in those spots. And there's also just a factor of being kind of capable of anything. Actually, here, let's just talk about this hand on the bottom right first. I raise, get squeezed by Patrick, and it's another one of those spots where there's not really a size I can make it with a hand that raises under the gun, and that can then fold to a shove. So I think it's just best to jam here. If I had opened in the cutoff and the button called, then I could be 3-bet or 4-bet folding with the hand like, I don't know, like 8-7 offsuit. But since I'm not raising hands that weak under the gun, I don't think it looks credible for me to rep a 4-bet fold. And I run into kings, which is unfortunate, but whatever. If the hands were reversed, we get it in. Back to just being unpredictable, I think that it's really important that you're capable of anything, and if you're not capable of anything, it's important that your opponents think you are. Because I certainly like to think I'm capable of pretty much anything, but there are times when I'm not. Here I put on the angry face to make him think I'm tilting, and then I shove my ace-king suited. As I was saying, there are times when I'm not capable of anything. There'll be times where I'll sit down, I'll be watching TV, or I'll have friends over, or I'm just, feeling lazy, and I'm just kind of autopiloting. And it's really important to have an image of being able to make plays like the double check raise on the top right earlier, and things like that, so that when you're not on your game and not making plays like that, people still give you credit for it, and you'll actually get paid off a lot when you're autopiloting in spots where most people don't bluff, and you won't be bluffing because you're autopiloting, but you are capable of it when you're on your game, and they know you're capable of it. It's also just a thing about fear, and I know Tommy Angelo, I don't want to teach everything that he teaches because it's kind of his material, but one thing that he taught me and has talked about is the that's a really hard word to say, hierarchy of fear. And it has to do with, at the table, there's always somebody at the table who's the most feared player at the table, or 4 of the people fear that guy. It's kind of just like a totem pole, and somebody's at the top, and it's important to be one of the more feared players at the table, because you'll end up making your opponents you'll find your opponents making a lot more mistakes against you because they're second guessing themselves. When somebody thinks you're gonna always read their soul, they're gonna make bad plays, whether it's playing more straightforward or more passive, or just kind of freaking out and making a bluff in a bad spot just because they're not thinking straight. It's important to have people afraid of you, and have people afraid that you're going to make a move on them, or that you're going to read their soul, things like that. So I think it's always important to mix in plays that, even if they are slightly minus EV, which I don't think that double check raise was minus EV, but it was probably close to neutral, slightly plus EV. Mixing in plays like that is really important for your overall game. Here on the bottom left is an kind of interesting spot. It's not all that interesting, as I think the only play is really to 4-bet. But stacks are a little bit awkward, so you have to kind of think about the amount to 4-bet, and then what to do on certain flops. Also, if I were to make a small 4-bet and the cutoff here were to shove, it'd be a pretty ugly spot, and you'd have to run some math and see if you can get it in there. But here, if McMath shoves, I'm certainly happy to call. I think he's going to be 3-betting wide on the button that deep, and I think he'll expect me to know that. I decided to go to 290. I think a little bit smaller is okay, but at the same time, I didn't really want to go to like 240 and get called, because again, when he would kind of, people are play happy, and he'd use every excuse on low flops to put me on ace king. And he'd be right in this case. So I'm not really looking to take a flop out of position here. I'd rather he make a decision to fold something like 9s, or to shove something like ace-jack or ace-queen. And I'm fine if he has a hand like Jack-10 suited. I'm fine with him folding that, and obviously I'd rather he shove, but I'm fine just picking up the pot rather than just calling and playing a pot out of position. So here on the top left, I called a raise pre-flop with ace-10 offsuit. Kind of similar spot to the king-10 offsuit on the top right earlier, where I guess we're not as deep, but it's not a hand that is really I get called by a lot of hands that dominate me when I 3-bet. Specifically, I mean ace jack and ace queen. And it does have some post flop value. It's not that much more to call, so I think it's a call from the big blind against cutoff open, even though he's kind of a tighter player. Here on the flop, it goes check check, and I think the range that people are checking behind is going to be very, very player dependent. On the turn, I could just lead out to kind of protect my hand / semi-bluff, but I think it doesn't accomplish too much, so I decided to check. And when he bets, I actually expect him to... I expect a decent player, which I think he is, from all that I know, to actually use like a delayed c-bet a good amount on this board with a hand like Jack 10. He'd just not bet the flop because he's afraid it's a flop that I'll go after. And that's another thing about hierarchy of fear, is that on flops like this, people are going to play suboptimally because they're just too afraid that you're going to go crazy on them. And it might be right to go crazy on them a lot of the time so that you maintain that image and kind of your place at the top of the table. But I do go ahead and check call the turn, since I think he'll be delayed c-betting enough. Also, I do have 6 outs almost always when I'm behind, so I think it's a pretty easy call. And on the ace river, I think leading would be a little bit too obvious. I mean, it'd be pretty tough for me to check call, check flop, check call turn with air or some kind of draw that missed, and then bluff lead into him on the ace river. I think most times that I have a draw on the turn, I'd be leading or check raising the turn rather than check calling with a hand like 6-5, let's say. So I just go ahead and check, hope to induce a bet. I'm not going to be check raising unless I get something, super powerful from his sizing or timing, which I doubt. I doubt I'd get some kind of tell strong enough to make me check raise this river. Even though I expect to be good a lot of the time, I don't expect to get paid off all that much, just because of how often I clearly have showdown value. On the bottom left, we get in against queens and flop an ace, and it holds up. And on the top left, he just checks behind with a delayed continuation bet, which I think is a good play by him against a tough player, at least some of the time. It's definitely good to have in your arsenal, because I think a lot of people assume that you have showdown value when you check behind. You can also rep like kings and aces when they hit, and when you do hit an 8 or a 6, people don't really expect you to have it. Expect you to have showdown or have a hand now, and so like they'll likely lead into you. So here with queens, I 3-bet and get cold called super deep. So we're almost 300 deep here, and there's 260 in the pot, so there's still a lot left in play here. I'm not really sure what kind of range he'll have. He's appears to be a pro. He's on 2 of my tables, and his stats seem pretty standard pro-like. I think that he'll have a lot of the hands like the ones I mentioned before, like jacks and queens, 10s, 9s. I think I'll also have some like 7-8 suited type hands, maybe an ace queen, something like that. So I was considering checking here for balance deception, but I actually think that he has jacks or 10s so often, and obviously 10s I'm behind, but jacks, 10s, 9s, and they're all calling a bet, and combo wise much more likely to have jacks or 10s. That I'd rather just bet here and get value from that on 1 or 2 streets. If he does raise me, it'll be pretty uncomfortable, and I'm not sure how I'd react to a big raise in this spot, given that I'm pretty readless. The thing about a big raise here from him is he's only repping 10-10, I think, and he folds. But I suppose he could call with 5s or 4s pre-flop, but that's pretty unlikely, and he certainly doesn't have like 10-5 suited. So it'd be pretty tough for me to lay that down. Alright, so here on the top right, I continuation bet with queen 10. And on the bottom right, I open with 6-7 suited and get 3-bet. And I'm going to go ahead and call with 6-7 suited. I think that it plays pretty well. He's not 3-betting that wide, which is kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, this is a hand with good implied odds against a big hand, but at the same time, I'd rather he have a wider range so that when I flop a pair like this, I'm not so often up against overpairs. On the top right, I was called, and I decided to check. I don't think people float ace-king high flops all that often, and I don't expect him to fold too much. And I don't really think. I mean, on the top right, it's an okay spot for me to bet the river. In theory, it's just because bet check bet is a really credible line. A lot of people should give you a lot of credit for it, but I see too many people with a hand like ace-4 just say, all right, I'm going to check behind the turn and call the river. Or same with a hand like king 10. They just say, I'll check behind the turn, call the river. So, and 2 flush draws missed, which shouldn't matter all that much since I didn't bet the turn, and the flush draws are not in my range all that often. But people use that as an excuse to call. Here on the bottom right, I decided to check behind the flop when he checks to me. I think that if I bet, he might call with ace high, but it's not a spot where I get a ton of value from worse hands, and it's also a spot where I do fear getting check raised. I'm not sure how I'd react to it. I also have a lot of backdoor draws. Or sorry, I guess, yeah. So if I turn a 5 or an 8, then I have an open-ender. If I turn a heart, I have a flush draw to go with my pair, and if I turn a 6 or 7, obviously I have 2 pairs. So I would really hate to be check raised off a hand with this many good turn cards for me. Queen of clubs is obviously not a good turn card. And I'm taking a note on the top about a loose call pre-flop. So he bets, and it's a pretty standard call. I don't think there's another option. I have the best hand a good amount of the time. I have a few outs if behind, good pot odds, etc., etc. And the river's a jack of clubs, pretty much one of the worst cards that could have hit. He has to be a little bit afraid that I have a hand that connected with that, but I'm not really considering turning my hand into a bluff. Especially, this is actually kind of important. If he were to bet something like 300 here, hold on, I think I just messed up the video. Oh wow. I got it back to the same place. Alright, sorry about that. I misclicked and dragged the slider on the video all the way back to the beginning, and then kind of estimated where to put it back, and it looks like I got it back to the right place. Anyways, if you were to bet something like 300, if you remember back to the first video, the very first hand, or close to the first hand, he made river bluff raise with the made hand. And that's important to note because he kind of, that plays in his arsenal, so he thinks that it's in other people's arsenal. I think it's really important to realize that people, even though everybody thinks differently, people use their own thought processes when they're thinking about how another player is going to play their hand. Even though I have a different thought process than him, when he's analyzing the way I've played my hand and trying to put me on a hand, he's using some form or some variation of his own thought process. And so it's important to know that, or to note, when people have a thought process that includes, river bluff raising as a common play with made hands, because they'll think that thought goes through your mind, whereas somebody who doesn't think about that won't consider it as heavily. So I don't think this is a spot where I would turn my hand into a bluff if he bet, or if he checked. He did bet 300. And, this is a river that I think he would bluff a little bit, just because if he did have a hand like 7-8, 5-7, even just like Ace X that decided to bet the turn. It's a good river to continue on, kind of. But there are just too many hands that beat me, and I think he is capable of value betting thin. So I go ahead and fold. The recording's lagging a little bit for me. I'm not sure whether it will be for you or not. I assume so, but so I apologize for that. I guess Camtasia is a big program to run. Maybe I have an old computer now, but it's not really interfering with the action. On the top right, I folded Queen 8 offsuit on the button. That'd be an okay spot to 3-bet, being that we're 250 big blinds deep in position. As I said in the first video, it's pretty much never wrong to do that, but you don't want to go overboard. Here on the bottom left, this is a spot where sometimes I would call to induce a squeeze, but actually, and I was thinking about doing that, but then I looked over at the stacks, and this isn't a spot where I'd really be comfortable getting 250 big blinds in if squeezed. So what I decided to do was just 3-bet, being happy to get it in against Sick 1. Just because, the attractiveness of inducing a squeeze goes down quite a bit when you can't get your money in when it happens. And on the top left, I have 10-8 suited, and that lagged a bit for me. I go ahead and call. I was considering a 3-bet because I wasn't really sure I could call here, and I think it's kind of a marginal call, to be honest, out of position. It really depends on your opponent and how well you play post-flop. But I decided to call, and I think it's fine. On the bottom left, I get 4-bet. Big. I think he potted it. It's a bizarre spot for me because I really just have no idea how he would react in this spot. There's when you play with somebody a lot, you get a feel for what spots they think are good bluff spots, but I really have no concept of what he thinks a good bluff spot is. I looked at my notes on him. There's nothing really helpful. On the top left, I go ahead and bet the turn. I think I have the best hand, and why not? Back to the bottom left, though. I think that readless, this is a really, really hard spot. At first, at the time, I took his pot size 4-bet to mean strength, and just him thinking, okay, I don't want to play. I don't want to see a flop out of position here with my aces or kings. I'm just going to pot it and hope I cooler him and get it in. But looking back on it now and looking at other squeezes he's made them all pot size. So I wonder if that's his only raise size. In which case this would become a little bit closer. So I actually decide to go ahead and fold, just because I don't think he's bluffing enough here this deep, and I don't really feel comfortable shoving this much money in the pot and calling with a hand like jacks that doesn't play all that well on flops against a pre-flop 4-better range. I decided to just fold. Here on the, I guess I'll go back to talk about the top right, but on the top left I bet the turn. And I'm considering a river bet here. I think I likely have the best hand. So I go ahead and bet. I think he might make a hero call with a hand like ace high, ace queen. He also might have an 8. And on the, I guess I'll go back on the bottom right actually. On the top left, he raises, which is really weird to me. because he's not repping all that much. I felt like a lot of he's repping a flush. I don't think he's checking back with a hand like jacks. He could have pocket fours, but that's pretty unlikely. But basically, I just think he called with a hand with some kind of showdown value. Like check backed with a hand with showdown value, called on the turn, and is turning it into a bluff now. I really don't give his line a ton of credit. So I think this is a call here. And turns out he did have sevens, which I don't know. I don't really like his play, just because, I mean, to me it was somewhat transparent. I thought he'd be doing that a lot. And really the only reason I took a little while to call is because I was thinking about the hand on the top right, which we'll go back into. But it's kind of a spot, and actually I'm actually working on a video about spots just like this, but he basically is repping a really narrow range. And I guess I'll just give the overview of the concept of the video, is that when you're repping a very narrow range of value hands, and you get to the river, hand combo wise, with so many more hands that could be bluffs, even if you're only bluffing a small percent of the time with those hands, the hand combos just far outweigh the bluff hand combos, far outweigh the value hand combos, to the point where even if you're only bluffing a small percentage of the time, it still means that you're more often bluffing than value raising, just because 5% of a million is more than 100% of 20. Sorry, I had to simplify that so I didn't get the math wrong, but I think you get the point, and I will explore it in greater depth in a future video. So now I'm going to go back to the 10-8 hand on the top right. So I raise from the hijack and get called. This is the player that called with King 5 suited earlier. So I think he's probably a weaker player. Obviously with 2 overs and double gutter, I bet the flop. 6 isn't a great card, but I think he will have some, he'll have a lot of, I think a player like him might have some floats in his range, just like rando Queen 9, or definitely gutters, so like a 10-9 or a King 8, things like that. And I think I could take him off some of those. The thing is, I'm not sure if he would fold a hand like King 8 on the turn. I think he might not, given... Basically, I'm basing all this on loose call pre-flop, but to me, I'm assuming that means he's not very good. And so here on the river, I have a tough decision, and I was partially wasn't really able to think it through because I had decisions on 2 other tables. But I think this might have been an okay spot to bluff. The problem is, if he is a decent player, then he'll notice that a lot of straight draws missed and a flush draw missed, and he'll make a call. He'll make a hero call a lot of the time. But if he's not a good player, I don't think he'll realize that. He'll just realize that even if he does have a hand like a 7, he'll say, "Oh, a 6 beats me, a queen beats me," and might lay that down. I don't expect to fold out a 7 a ton. What I was hoping to fold, if I bet, was a hand like King 8 or Ace 9, things like that. Not Ace 9, Ace 8, I guess. I don't think Ace 9 would call, but like Ace 5 or Jack 5 suited. If he's playing King 5 suited, tune under the gun raise, he might be playing hands like that. But I did decide to go ahead and check, and I think this is actually pretty close. Given, I don't have a lot of reads on the player at all, but I don't think that's an excuse to give up on a play, necessarily. I think a lot of times people say, well, if I knew him better, I might make this play. But even when you don't know anything or know much about somebody, you can still make a play based on your assumptions of the average player, given the reads you have on him. Or rather, let's say I take all 5-10 players that are one tabling as far as I know that call an under the gun raise with King 5 suited. I take my average read of all those players and make the best play against that range of player. And I'll be wrong some of the time, but on average, I'll be making the best play. So I think not knowing a ton about somebody is no excuse for kind of just playing straightforward. I think you can't really be afraid to find out later that you were wrong against that player when, on average, you're going to be right. But that said, I still think it was a close spot, and I'm okay with the check that I made there. And yeah, he did have a pretty legitimate hand. He called the flop with the gutter and ace high, turned a flush draw with it, called again, and checked down his ace high. So nothing really that I can use there to solidify my read of him as a weak player, because that was fairly well played hand by him. And making generalized reads like that, to do that, it's really important to take notes in the way that I guess I've taken notes a few times, where rather than just saying general things, you list specific actions that player took with specific hands. And when you do that, you can really kind of hone in on their thought process sometimes. When you see a few hands, a few examples of the way that they've played certain spots, you can kind of piece that together to form a good idea of the way that they're thinking about the game. Whereas if you have general notes like loose pre-flop, tight on rivers, something like that, like those are useful notes to have. You'll give that person a wider range pre-flop when they call, and you'll bluff them more on rivers and value bet them less. But it doesn't really let you know how they think about the game. It just tells you a couple tendencies that they have. And here on the top right, he looks like he's limp min re-raised, so I actually didn't see that during the session because I don't remember that, but that's something that's interesting and important to note, which would make it more likely that my read that he's a weak player is right. And now he makes a small bet on the flop. It's tough to know what to put people on when they do things like that. A lot of times I'd put them on a hand like... I see people do it with monsters, but I usually see them do it with hands like just rando hands, or maybe like ace-6, where he limps just because, and then when he gets raised, he's like, well, I probably have the best hand. I don't like when people raise me, and then min re-raises. But I hope this gets a showdown. I'm really curious. If I was Todd, I would just call down because I want to see. Big T is Todd. I may or may not have mentioned that in the first video, but he's a friend of mine. Here on the bottom left, I have 9s, and it's a pretty standard spot to call. It looks like he does have a tight range, which is good for me. Although, you can't assume too much, because he might be the type of player that would just cold call here with his big hands and then 3-bet weaker hands, or some combination of 3-betting some of the time with big hands and not others. So on the top right, he did have ace-9 suited, which is, I don't know, it's just interesting. Limp re-raise, obviously not a whole lot of reason to it, but you might be able to learn a little bit about his thought process by remembering that, even if you don't find yourself in the same spot where he limp re-raises you. So here with the 9s, iffy spot. I think that he definitely has aces and kings in his range. He might have a hand like ace-king, but I think he could check that behind some. But given that, he could be 3-betting air, he could be continuation betting, or like 3-betting continuation betting hand like ace 10. I do have backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw. And there are a lot of turns, like on a 7, he'd likely check behind an overpair, so I'd get to see a river. Kind of tight fold by me on the top with king queen offsuit in the big blind. I think it's probably best against a competent player. So he does check the jack turn, which I'd expect him to do with big hands, and I hit the perfect river. There's 500 in the pot. We're kind of I don't know, we're a little deep to check shove. If I check and he bets like 450, I could shove, but I'd rather just go smaller maybe. I could bet, but I don't think that I get a ton of value, except from hands that are going to bet themselves. And he could occasionally bluff as well. So I want to give him the chance to, if he has a hand like kings and I make a large bet, he could actually lay that down. Probably won't, but could. Whereas if I check, I'd expect him to bet kings most of the time, and maybe, hopefully, call a check raise. If he does have air somehow, I don't expect him to bluff the way the board came off that often, but it's a possibility, and he's obviously not calling if I bet. And he could have a marginal made hand like an 8, but I'd expect that to check behind. Unlikely he has a 9 because I have 2 of them. If he does have a big hand like queen 10 or 7-5 or 10-7, then I think betting probably is slightly best because I don't get stacks in otherwise. Whereas if I bet, he probably raises and then I can shove and he'd call usually. Whereas if I check and he bets 400 and I make it like 1400, he's not going to re-raise. He's just going to call with those hands. But all in all, I think that since I was putting him on a tight range pre-flop, I think I should go with the play that makes the most against hands like ace or kings, which is most likely holding, and go for the check raise. It's also another case of wanting to... it's very important to me to be able to check raise the river with value hands and bluffs, because people these days are value betting relentlessly, especially against a station like me, and so I want to be able to punish them for it. Unfortunately, he checks behind. He actually had a decent draw, but was 3-betting light there. If I were going back to the session now, I'd take down the note that he check back the turn, which I think is a good-ish play that not everybody makes, but just important. So it'd be important to note, and also that he didn't consider bluffing that river, which I also think is a good play, but not one that everybody makes. Basically, anytime somebody does something that distinguishes them from everybody else, I like to take a note of it. On the bottom right there with 6-4 suited, I don't know. I think I'd prefer to 3-bet or call with that hand. It's good enough, and I feel like I've a decent... I didn't like the way Zoli played 7s on the top left earlier. I think that showed a little bit of like a lack of good reasoning, and so I think I play a few more pots against him. Alright, so on the top left I raise 6s and get led into by Zoli. He led into me in the last video on an ace-jack 7 two-tone flop. I'm actually really curious what kind of hands he's doing this with, but I can't do anything with my 6s, so I just fold. Alright, so I raised Jack 10 offsuit on the bottom right and flopped the nuts on a pretty draw heavy board. I have a couple options here. Pretty much 2 exactly. I can continuation bet or I can check. I think it's a little bit close. The thing is that, all right, here is the problem with checking. The benefit to checking is that I think that Sick One is a really observant player, high intensity player, which I've talked about before, but again, might talk about in the future more. But basically that means that he when he sees a good spot to make a move, he's going to do it rather than kind of autopilot, given what I've learned about him so far. He's a pretty strong player. So I think that if I check here, I've shown a lot of weakness as a preflop raiser checking on a board like this. This is a board that preflop raisers give up on all the time. And he is in position, can very credibly rep a hand that nailed this flop. So I think that I might get a bluff out of him a lot of the time. You know, ideally he bets and then Zoli raises. But even if that happens, anything I do screams strength. And the same is true if Sick One bets and Zoli calls or Zoli folds. In either of those cases, if I check raise, I think I look huge. And if I check call, it's going to be tough for me to get money on later streets. So that's certainly a play that I'll mix in because I, as I said many times, like to be capable of anything. But I think there's so many hands that can call me, and I don't want to do something like check raise and give the strength of my hand away. So I'd rather just bet here, get a call from like one pair or an open ender or just a gutter, and then hope that somebody makes a move. So I'm called, and good turn for me. So nothing too exciting. I'm just going to go ahead and make the bet. I make kind of a loose peel on the bottom left pre-flop with 10-7 off, but like I said, I like to call a lot in position from the big blind. I think that's my standard with that hand. And I'm obviously going to call the flop. I don't really see any merit to raising or folding. So I bet 170 on the bottom right. It's a pretty standard amount. And he shoves, snap call, and he has Jack 9. I think that's it's a weird spot by him. You know, the board is really draw heavy, but at the same time, it's not a board that I would bet with hands like, I don't know, Ace-4 diamonds, because I do get check raised so often and have to fold a hand that's really strong. Or let's say Ace-4 of hearts. He kind of has to hope that I have an air type hand, or maybe like 7-8 that I could consider folding. I probably wouldn't. Or like a hand like 10-8 that he's ahead of, or 10-9 that he's ahead of. I don't hate his play, as he does have a decent amount of equity and some fold equity, but it's a really, really tough spot for him on the turn. I think his flop play is standard, and though he could lead, and the turn is just a really ugly spot for him to be in. And I would usually check call in his spot, but I don't really love that option either. So can't hate on him too much for his check shove there. It's just found himself in a gross spot and ran into a big hand. On the top right, I raise Queen 9 suited and get called by the weak player at the table, or from what I've gathered so far. He min raises the flop, and this can mean a couple things depending on the player. He could just have like a one pair hand, like King 10, or like a weak queen, or a strong queen. He also could have a set, two pair, or like a gutter or an open ender. I think people do it with a whole wide range of hands. He's, the thing about a player who's kind of erratic is he's going to be unpredictable, and I don't really know. I don't really know his range here, but I'll start off by calling. And on the bottom left, I get bet into again, and I have mid pair on a board with a lot of straight draws, so I just go ahead and call. On the top right, I turn a flush draw, so I'm obviously not folding the turn. And he bets 50 into 277. To me, this means, I think it means a draw a lot of the time from a weaker player. To be honest, it's been a while since I played against like pretty weak players. The weak players for me are like good players that are playing really high, that aren't like great. So my reads may be off and yours might be better than mine, but to me this means a draw a lot of the time, a weak pair a lot of the time. And since I'm doing so well against a draw, and I don't want to kind of give him a cheap card, I just had to check raise here. And it'll be pretty tough for me to, if he pots it over me, then I'd maybe have to fold, but I don't expect him to get re-raised all that often at all. And if I am behind, it's not by much, so I don't mind putting in a check raise here. I think I'm ahead almost always, though. And on the bottom left, I get bet into again. All I know about this player is, well, I know that he's a smart player, or at least that he's capable of a lot of things. So I guess I'll talk about the bluff first. He seems like a good player, and he's capable of a lot of things. This is a board where there are a lot of straight draws that missed, given that just hand combo wise, any 4, any 6, any 9 is a gutter or open ender. Or I guess those are all, yeah, gutter or open ender. There are no flush draws, and I don't expect him to pure bluff this turn all that often. You could also have like an ace deuce or like a jack 10. Given all the straight draws and the king rolled off, I think king is a card that people bluff a little bit more than they should. I think this is actually somewhat clear call, given the information I have. It looks like I was considering shoving, but like I said before, I think that against a player who can bluff shove rivers, you got to be careful bluff shoving rivers, especially if you're me playing 5-10 making a video. I just think I have gotten away with a few plays so far in this video, but I think especially a player like him that's capable of plays himself is gonna be eager to pick me off. So on the top right, I get min re-raised, and I'm honestly just really confused. I think he probably has me beat now, but not positive. I obviously have a lot of outs, so I go ahead and call. I don't think there's another option. River's a pretty terrible card, and so I'm just going to check fold it. And he actually checks behind with queen 10, so he did have top 2 pair and bet 50 into 277 on the turn. I don't think I noted that because I was busy with this hand on the bottom left. But I certainly, that's something I would note, not to read too much into his weak bet sizes. So I go ahead and finally make the call, which I think is the right call, but gets shown 8-9, so it was a good, somewhat standard, but good value bet by him. And I'm still fine with that call. I can't be right every time. There I just had queen 9 suited on the bottom left, and that's a hand that I would occasionally 3-bet from the small blind. But I didn't want him to think I was retaliating after being upset that I lost that pot. That's not something to read too much into and to give too much weight to, but that's what I was thinking at the time. And I do think that when somebody makes not that his play was super crazy, or super sick, but when somebody makes a good play and is feeling good against you, they're more likely to make more moves on you. So I felt that he'd be a little more likely than usual to play back at me if I 3-bet there. And so this will be wrapping up the video. There are actually, I believe, no more interesting hands, but I'll let it play through the rest of it. I hope you guys learned something just about really just being capable of a lot of different things and balance. I mean, I'm going to talk about balance to death in all my videos, but I guess we get all in with jacks here against short stacks, so that's interesting. Yeah, in addition to balance, which I'll always talk about, just being able to make plays that in any spot, nobody really check raises flop, check raises turn, and people don't check raise enough rivers, or bluff raise enough rivers, or value raise thin on rivers, and you have to be capable of things like that, or you let people either bet turns too thin or value bet rivers too thin, and you also just let them get too comfortable. And getting people out of their comfort zone is really important. And when you have other players afraid of you, they'll make a lot of bad decisions. So that's enough recap, I guess. I probably said all that in the video. But thanks for watching, guys. And definitely give me feedback. This is the first kind of lower stakes video that I did, which I know people are asking for. Or I guess there are mixed feelings on it. But definitely let us know in the forums or in this video review what you'd like to see, because I'm pretty much open to do whatever. This is Phil Galfond for BlueFirePoker.com. Take care.